Hello, and welcome to my Introduction to Programming with Python course. Now, this course is primarily aimed at people who have some limited experience with programming before, or perhaps have to learn it for school but don't feel like you have a good grip on the fundamentals. And so we're not only just going to be learning programming concepts in this course, but we're going to try and go over and learn some programming fundamentals, which will help set you up to learn how to program in any language. Now, of course, if you've never programmed before and just want to learn how to code in Python, I think you should be able to follow along with this just fine, because we're going to take everything step by step and explain fundamental concepts. So, one of the first things we're going to need to do to get set up is install Python. Now, if that sounds a little bit strange to you, like what does it mean to install a programming language, you'll get used to it. But maybe in a few episodes' time, or maybe in another series, I'll explain sort of the concepts behind why we have to install programming languages and how different programming languages run. But Python is something called an interpreted language, which means we need to install a version of the Python interpreter to be able to run our scripts. So let's do that now. Okay, so moving a bit slower now, you're going to want to open up your web browser of choice and simply search for Python. Normal spelling, just like the snake. Okay, now, one of the top options you should see is python.org. So if we just click on this link, it'll bring you to a web page that should look something like this. So this is where we're going to download and install our version of Python from. Now, as you can see, I'm operating on Windows, so this tutorial will be a little bit more Windows centric as to how to get things set up. But if you're using a Mac, just try and follow along as best you can. I think everything should be fairly similar and you should be able to get it working. But if you get stuck, I'll put a link in the description for a good guide as to how to install Python on a Mac. Alright, so with that said, come to this Downloads tab and simply download the latest version. Now, at the time of writing, this is a 3.1.1 version, but you might have a slightly newer one. It doesn't matter, just download it. So click the installer, download it to your computer, and then once it's finished downloading, we can simply click on it to run it. Now, it gives you a few options here, including a default installation thing, but generally I advise that you follow along closely here with my custom installation setup, because it'll help make things a bit easier and a bit more operable for you in the future. So one of the very important things that you must not miss is down the bottom of this settings window, you'll see it has an add python.exe to path option. And yeah, we want to tick yes, and I'll explain why later. So if we tick on that, and then click customize installation. And here we just want to make sure that everything's still ticked. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it's just easiest for first time users to leave this all ticked. So next we're going to go to the next menu, and we're just going to check all of these options. Now, I don't really recommend touching any of these unless you really know what you're doing. These are pretty good defaults. However, the one thing that I do want to stress is the install location. So you can set the install location to anywhere you want on your computer, but I recommend putting it in a specific folder where you know where it is, and I'll explain why in a moment. So if we click Browse, it's going to bring up a fairly ugly interaction screen. But generally, I recommend setting up a folder somewhere at the root of your C drive, but you can put it anywhere you want. Just don't put it on your desktops or documents folder, put it somewhere sensible. Like I said, I recommend on the root of your C drive. I normally create a new folder here called Environment, where I put all my programming tools in. So as you can see, I've already got a folder for Python, so I'm just going to select that and say, yes, I want to use C/environment/Python as my install location. If you're not sure about where to install it, then don't change it, just leave it as the default. Okay, so now what we do is simply going to press install and wait for that to install. Okay, cool. So that didn't take too long on my machine, and you can see here we've got a setup was successful screen, which should be what you're looking at when you see it. So all we're going to do now is quickly click this close button. All right, now before we do anything else, we're going to check if it has installed correctly. So if you're on Windows or probably on Mac, you're going to want to put up Windows Search or Finder on Mac and search for Terminal. And you should get an application that looks something like this. Again, it'll look different depending on your operating system and version, but it will look something like this. You probably won't have a pretty background. It will probably just be black and white, but the idea is that you'll have some sort of application like this. If you don't get a search result for terminal, you can also search for CMD and you can launch the command prompt. And on older versions of Windows, this should work for you. But either way, CMD or terminal, you want to try and search for one of them and open up a prompt that looks something like this. Okay. So this is called the command line, and it's where we can insert direct commands to our computer to tell it to do things. Old computers and, back in the day on real original operating systems, this used to be the only way you could interact with a computer, was through a text-based terminal. And now we're sort of used to clicking visual interfaces, but this is sort of the OG way of doing computing. The command line is a really powerful tool for developers because it allows us to get really complicated operations across to our computer and make it do things that we couldn't easily do just using the visual interaction. So, to check if Python's installed, what we're going to simply do now is type Python in the command line, just like this, Then we're going to put a space, we're going to put a little hyphen, like a little dash or a minus sign, and then put a capital V, like this, Python space dash V. And we're going to hit enter. Now, as you can see, if your Python installation has been installed correctly, it will print out the version that we installed onto the command line, just like this. Now, it's possible that if you don't have it, if you didn't get Python installed correctly the first time, then it might come up with some message like, I don't know, it will probably say something like Python is not recognized as an internal or external command, and on Mac it'll say something different. That means that we didn't quite get it to install correctly. Now, why is that? Well, the way the command prompt works is when you put in a command on the command prompt, what that's actually doing is it's searching your computer for a program with the same name. However, there's lots of files on modern computers. There's millions and millions of files on modern computers. And so if I had to search every single file for a program called Python, it would take an unbelievably long amount of time. So computers get around this by keeping a list of specific locations called the path. And basically, when we run a command, it will only search the locations that are stored on the path for programs to run. And this massively reduces the amount of files it has to search through. So if you remember in the first step where we made sure to click add to path for python.exe, that was essential because it allows us to access Python in our command line. However, if you forgot to check it, then you will be getting an error something like this. Sometimes, even when you do check it, you still get an error something like this. So to get around that, let me show you what to do. So first and foremost, we need to open up File Explorer, okay? So if you set a custom installation like I recommended you do, then you will know where to find Python on your computer. So for example, we stored it under our, if we just go to here, we put it on our C drive, under Environment, and under Python, okay? And you can see here there's a whole bunch of files, but inside this folder, one of the files is python.exe, okay? So just say our command wasn't showing up here. How do we fix that? Well, we find the folder where python.exe is located, and then we copy the path like this. It's the direct path to where it's installed. If we do Control-C, we can copy it, and on Windows, what this means is we can search for something called environment, and you'll get a thing that says edit the system environment variables. So if we click that and go environment variables, scroll down to the system variables part, and you'll see one called path. So what we're going to do is select path and then press this edit button. And then we're going to press new, and we're going to paste in that path we just found. Okay, and this will be adding that folder to the path, and it'll say, hey, Windows, when I run a command, search this folder for the Python executable. All right, now I've already got that working on my machine, so I'm going to hit cancel, but if this was a problem that affected you, you would hit OK, and you would continue to hit OK to apply them. What you would then have to do is close this terminal and start a new one for the changes to take effect. But once again, after you've done that, running Python-V, you should see the Python version printed to the console. Okay, so the next thing we're going to need is something called a text editor. It's nothing fancy. Now, many of you probably will have seen something like Notepad, just a simple text editor where you can write things, if I can type correctly. All right. So all code takes the form of raw text on our computer. However, writing code in something where it's just plain text with plain coloring can be quite challenging. So typically what we use is something called a code editor, or sometimes an IDE for more fancy software. And this will provide us with things like autocomplete features, syntax highlighting, and a whole bunch of other useful things that programmers need to effectively write code. So for Python programming, I recommend one called Visual Studio Code. So if you search for VS Code in your browser of choice, and select one of the first options, it will be code.visualstudio.com. You'll see something like this. This is the application that you want to install, okay? So you'll get presented with whatever version, whether you're using Mac or Windows, you'll get presented with the relevant version here, but you're going to click download and you're going to go through the install process. It's pretty simple. You just download it, you run the installer, and you'll get it working on your machine, all right? And you can open it up just simply by searching for code, and it will come up. And that's what we're going to use for our code editing. Now, I've already installed it, but I'll let you to go ahead and do that now. Because once you've installed it, you'll be presented with a screen that looks something like this. If it's the first time you've run it, you'll probably have some like getting started information in the middle of the screen here, but we don't need to worry about that. One of the important things that makes Visual Studio Code so good is that we can install extensions on it that allow us to do more fancy things with our programming. So On the left-hand tab here, this is all your main working files, and this is where all your main working tabs are stored, where you can do different things. So this little 4 square one here, it's called extensions. If we click on it, right, it will allow us to install some of these extensions. Now, some things will come pre-installed, some things won't. But if this is the first time you've installed Visual Studio Code, you're going to want to search for Python in the extension search bar here, and click on the top one. It's a verified package by Microsoft. Make sure you install that one because it's the best quality. And when you do that, you'll have an option to click install. Now, I've already got it installed, but if you didn't, you would simply come up, press install, and wait for it to install. Once it's finished installing, you'll need to restart your Visual Studio Code because it will take a moment to take effect and make those changes. So that would be getting VS Code set up. Now, just to check that we've got everything working correctly, we're going to do one final step. So what you're going to do is, for the moment, I'm going to go to my desktop and I'm just going to create a new folder. Now you can put this anywhere you want on your computer, just make sure you know where you put it. And I'm going to call it code. And inside this folder, I'm going to come inside and I'm going to right click. I'm going to go show more options if I'm on Windows 11. If you're on Windows 10, you won't need to click the show more options. You'll just get this menu straight away. And then I'm going to press open with code. Now, some of you, especially if you're on a Mac, you might not get the option to open with code. So the alternative option is open VS Code, go file, open folder, and then hunt for that code folder we just created and open it up. All right. Now, right now, it shouldn't show anything. It's an empty folder. We haven't put anything in it. So we're going to create our first Python file just to quickly check our test setup in this episode. So click new file, and then here we're going to call this program, and then .py. Now the file extension here technically doesn't matter, but keeping our file extensions consistent is very helpful. So for those of you who don't know, a file extension is simply the bit of text that comes after a dot in a file name, and those tell our computers how to treat or handle the file. So by using .py, our computer understands it's a Python file, and it'll make it easier for us to work with and run the Python code. Okay, so now that we've created this code file, all we're going to do is type a very, very, very simple program. All right, I'm not going to explain it in this episode. I'm just going to write it and you can test it too. So it's going to be simple. We're going to type print. Oops, again, if I could type correctly, print like printer. And then we're going to do an opening quote and a closing quote. So let me zoom in just to make this a bit clearer. All right, that's our opening quote, that's our closing quote. So it's just a standard set of double quotes on your keyboard. All right, when I typed one, you'll notice that VS Code immediately put the other one in for me. So that's normal behavior. So if you see that happen on your computer in your VS Code machine, don't worry too much, that's normal. Okay, now between, and this is very important, between the two quotes, we're just going to simply type hello world. This is the perhaps most commonly written first program in any given language. Okay, so once we've done that, you'll see that there's a little dot appearing next to our file name here. And that's just simply telling us that this file isn't saved. So if we go ahead and save the file, you'll see the dot goes away, so it knows that we've saved it. All right, and now we're ready to run it. So how do we do that? Well, if you use, you can pull up the integrated terminal inside VS Code. So on Windows, it's Control and then tilde, which is the little key above the tab key on your keyboard. Now, if you're on a Mac or you can't find the key on your keyboard on Windows or whatever, you can do this another way, right? Under this little menu at the top, you'll see terminal. You're going to want to press new terminal, and it will bring the same thing we've just pulled up, as well as it'll tell you what the keyboard shortcut is on your machine, right? So if we just drag this up here, now you'll notice this here looks very similar to what we just saw in our terminal over here. And that's because it's essentially the same thing. It's just another command line, but this one's built into VS Code, so we don't even have to change Windows, which is really helpful. Now, on Windows, this defaults, for some reason, to PowerShell. So we don't want to use PowerShell. We want to switch that. So where it says PowerShell over here on the right of the terminal window, if we go next to it and press the little down arrow and select Command Prompt, which will just change a few things in the background and bring us to a prompt that looks quite similar but is a bit different. On Mac, you don't have to worry about doing that. And in a future episode, I will actually explain how we can change that from defaulting to Command Prompt. Okay, so now this shows us a few different things. So first of all, it shows us, it says something here, it's got like a file path here, and that's actually telling us what folder we're currently opened in the command prompt. So as you can see here, when we first open the command prompt, we're just in a normal C users Angus folder. It's kind of whatever. But here, because we opened up VS Code in the code folder, it's also opened up our command prompt in the code folder. And this is important because if you remember before when I explained that we can only access and run files that are on the path, basically, if we're not in the right folder, then we won't be able to necessarily find where our program is when we try and run it, because it'll also search whatever folder we're in first. So the way it works is it searches the folder you're in first for the file name you're trying to run, and then it'll search other things on the path. So we have to make sure our command prompt is in the right place, otherwise we'll get a file not found when we try and run our code. Okay, so assuming that you've gotten everything working up until this point and you've copied the steps, we can now type Python and then type the name of our file name. Now, it has to be the exact same name. If you've got a space in your file name, I recommend removing it. Typically, you don't want spaces in the name of your program files because it makes it more painful to run them. So we just simply type Python, and then in our case, we called our file program.py. So just type it in like that, and then, well, make sure you get the R as well, program.py, and then hit enter. And you can see that hello world is printed in all of its typoed glory. Bit of an extra W there that we didn't need. So what's actually happening here? Okay, well, if we were just to break it down simply, what's happening? Okay, so we installed Python and we got that working by adding it to the path and making sure that everywhere could access it. Again, if you installed it correctly the first time, you didn't need to add it to path. It was already done in the background for us. All right? So that gave us access to this Python program on a command line anywhere we wanted. Then we installed VS Code, and that allowed us to write some code in a pretty format that looks nice to our eyes. Now, this final command sort of combines those two principles. So we say, hey Python, I would like you to run my code file that is stored in program.py. And what Python does is it searches the local directory, which in our case is code, for a file called program.py, and then it reads it and runs the code inside it. Now, this code here does pretty much what it says. It just prints the text inside of it to the screen. And that's why, don't worry about that, and that's why we see it printed out here. So that's the end to just the first episode of just getting you set up and installed. And in the next episode, we're going to look at some other fundamental concepts like variables and what it actually means to write code like print statements and things like that. So yeah, thanks for watching and stick around to keep learning the ins and outs of why things work the way they work.